Thomas Riley's repair dock occupied the kind of orbital space that most people considered a navigation hazard, floating among the debris field of what had once been Kepler 186f's primary mining station. To Thomas, it was home, a collection of interconnected modules, salvaged hull sections, and improvised docking bays that somehow managed to keep both atmosphere and his business operational despite defying several engineering principles. He was elbow-deep in the quantum manifold of a particularly stubborn cargo hauler when his proximity alarms started chiming. The incoming vessel registered on his sensors as expensive, the kind of sleek, elegant craft that usually avoided his corner of space in favor of proper shipyards with things like safety certifications and customer service ratings. "This is Riley's repair, come in unknown vessel," he called over the comm, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. "Request permission to dock for emergency repairs." The voice was female, with an accent he couldn't place and a quality that suggested its owner was accustomed to being obeyed. "I can pay standard rates." Thomas glanced at his empty docking schedule and his equally empty account balance. "You're cleared for Bay 3. Fair warning though, I'm a one-man operation, so if you're expecting luxury service, you might want to try the facility at Proxima Station. I prefer discretion over luxury." The ship that maneuvered into his docking bay was a thing of beauty, flowing lines that seemed more grown than built, hull plating that shifted color subtly in the station lighting, and propulsion systems that hummed with harmonics Thomas had never heard before. It was also, he noted professionally, damaged in ways that suggested either very bad luck or very determined pursuit. The airlock cycled, and Thomas got his first look at his mysterious customer. She wore robes that managed to look both practical and elegant, with a veil that concealed most of her face except for eyes the color of deep space and ears that curved to delicate points. Even with limited visibility, she moved with the kind of fluid grace that suggested either extensive combat training or aristocratic breeding. "I am Zara," she said simply. "You are the engineer." "Thomas Riley, owner and operator." "What happened to your ship?" "Mechanical difficulties. I encountered some turbulence." Thomas walked around her vessel, noting scorch marks that looked suspiciously like weapon impacts and hull breaches that had been hastily sealed with emergency patches. "This turbulence wouldn't happen to have involved people shooting at you, would it? Does that affect your repair rates?" "Only if they're likely to shoot at me too." She paused, apparently considering the question seriously. "I believe I have evaded pursuit successfully." "That's reassuring." Thomas activated his diagnostic scanner and immediately frowned at the readings. "Ma'am, I've got to be honest, I've never seen technology like this. Your power core operates on principles I don't recognize, your navigation system appears to interface directly with organic neural networks, and your hull composition includes materials that aren't in any engineering database I have access to. But can you repair it?" Thomas studied the readouts, his engineering curiosity warring with his practical caution. The ship represented technology decades ahead of anything he'd worked with, but the fundamental principles of keeping things running were universal. "I can fix anything that's broken," he said finally. "Question is whether you trust a frontier mechanic to work on what's obviously a very expensive piece of hardware. I have observed that the best solutions often come from those who approach problems without preconceptions about what should or shouldn't be possible." "Well, that's definitely me. I've been making things work that probably shouldn't for the better part of 20 years. Zara reached into her robes and produced a small pouch that clinked with the sound of precious metals. "Will this cover your services?" Thomas opened the pouch and nearly dropped it. The rare elements inside were worth more than he typically earned in a year. "This is way too much for standard repairs. Consider the excess payment for discretion and accommodation." "Accommodation? I would prefer to remain here during the repairs. To observe your methods." Thomas gestured at his cramped living quarters and workshop facilities. "It's not exactly luxury accommodations. I've got a spare bunk and access to the food synthesizer, but that's about it." "That will be sufficient." Over the next few hours, as Thomas began the delicate process of understanding her ship's systems, he found himself increasingly intrigued by his mysterious passenger. Zara watched his work with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed an intimate knowledge of starship engineering far beyond what any normal passenger should possess. "Your approach is remarkably intuitive," she observed as Thomas jury-rigged a temporary bypass for her damaged quantum processors. "Most technicians would attempt to repair the original systems rather than creating alternative pathways. Most technicians work with technology they understand. When you're dealing with systems that operate on principles you've never seen before, sometimes the best approach is to make them work with what you do know. And you find this satisfying?" Thomas paused in his work, considering the question. "There's something deeply satisfying about taking something that's broken and making it whole again. Especially when everyone else says it can't be done." "Yes," she said quietly. "I understand that feeling." Something in her tone suggested she wasn't talking about machinery, but Thomas didn't press. Everyone who ended up at his remote facility had their reasons for avoiding more conventional options. "So," he said, returning to his work, "what does a minor noble from the inner systems do for entertainment when she's not fleeing turbulence?" "How do you know I'm from the inner systems?" "Your ship's registration codes, the materials in your hull composition, and the fact that you speak standard Galactic with a core world's accent but try to hide it." Zara was quiet for a moment. "You are very observant. It comes with the job. When people bring me broken things, they usually have stories they don't want to tell. And you don't ask for those stories. Everyone deserves their privacy. Besides, I'm usually more interested in fixing their ships than fixing their problems. What if the two are connected?" Thomas looked up from the quantum manifold he was calibrating. "Then I fix what I can and hope it helps with what I can't." As the station's day cycle wound toward evening, Thomas found himself sharing his simple meal of reconstituted proteins and synthetic vegetables with someone who had probably never eaten anything that didn't come from the finest establishments in the galaxy. To his surprise, Zara seemed genuinely appreciative. "This is quite good," she said, though Thomas suspected she was being polite. "It's terrible, but it's nutritionally complete and doesn't require much preparation time. Sometimes simple solutions are the most elegant." "Is that a philosophy you live by?" "It is one I am learning to appreciate." Thomas settled back in his chair, studying his enigmatic guest. "Zara, can I ask you something?" "You may ask." "Are you in some kind of trouble?" "Real trouble, not just inconvenient politics." She was quiet for so long that Thomas wondered if she was going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone carrying burdens too heavy to share. "Yes, Thomas. I am in very real trouble indeed. But for the first time in longer than I care to remember, I am also exactly where I want to be." 3 days into the repairs, Thomas had learned several important things about his mysterious guest. First, Zara possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of starship engineering that she tried to pass off as hobbyist interest. Second, she made coffee that was somehow better than anything his synthesizers should have been capable of producing. Third, she had nightmares that left her standing at the observation windows for hours, watching the stars as if expecting them to bring unwelcome news. "The quantum resonance chamber is fascinating," she said, watching Thomas install a replacement component he'd fabricated from salvaged parts. "I've never seen anyone adapt Centauri technology to work with Terran power systems." "You've seen a lot of Centauri technology for someone who's just a minor noble." "I travel extensively. One encounters various educational opportunities." Thomas paused in his work, studying her carefully. "Zara, exactly what kind of minor noble are you?" "The kind who asks too many questions and causes too many problems." "That's not really an answer." "It's the only answer I can give you right now." Before Thomas could press further, his long-range communications array crackled to life with an incoming priority transmission. The sender's credentials made him freeze: Imperial Navy High Command, requesting immediate response from all civilian facilities. Riley's repair, responding to Imperial priority transmission, he said, activating the comm channel while gesturing for Zara to stay out of visual range. The face that appeared on his screen belonged to Admiral Hayes, whose reputation for efficiency and ruthlessness was legendary throughout the frontier regions. "Mr. Riley, I am Admiral Hayes, conducting official Imperial Navy business. Have you had any unusual visitors in the past week? Specifically, any single female passengers traveling alone in high-end vessels?" Thomas felt Zara's presence behind him like a physical weight, though she remained carefully out of the transmission's pickup range. "Admiral, I run a repair facility. Most of my customers are unusual in one way or another. Could you be more specific about what you're looking for?" "Classified Imperial business, Mr. Riley. I need you to understand that harboring certain individuals could be considered an act of treason against the Empire." "I understand, Admiral. But I need you to understand that I make my living fixing ships for people who value discretion. If I started reporting on my customers, I'd be out of business pretty quickly." Admiral Hayes studied Thomas through the transmission link with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to getting answers whether people wanted to give them or not. "Mr. Riley, let me be very clear. The Empire is searching for someone of critical importance. This person's location affects the stability of several star systems. If you have information and fail to share it, the consequences will be severe. And if I don't have information, then you have nothing to worry about. We'll be conducting physical inspections of all facilities in this sector within the next 48 hours. The transmission ended, leaving Thomas staring at a blank screen and feeling the weight of Zara's silence behind him. "So," he said without turning around, "want to tell me what that was about?" "Thomas, I need you to know that I never intended to put you in danger." "That's not an answer either." She moved to stand beside him, and for the first time since her arrival, her composed mask showed cracks. "The people searching for me, they are not my friends. If they find me here, they will assume you are complicit in harboring me. The penalties for that assumption would be severe." "How severe?" "The kind that tend to be permanent." Thomas leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. "Zara, who are you really?" "I am someone who has made powerful enemies by asking the wrong questions and refusing to accept the wrong answers." "Are you a criminal?" "That depends on which faction of the Imperial government you ask." Thomas stood and began pacing, a habit he'd developed for processing complicated problems. "Okay, let's approach this logically. You're obviously someone important enough to warrant a sector-wide search by Imperial Navy forces. You have knowledge of advanced technology that suggests either high-level government access or extensive military training. You carry enough rare metals to buy a small ship, and you're running from people who consider harboring you an act of treason. Those are accurate observations. But you're not going to tell me who you actually are." "Thomas, there are some truths that, once known, cannot be unknown. Some knowledge that changes everything forever. Maybe I'm okay with change." Zara turned to face him fully, and Thomas caught a glimpse of something in her expression that looked like pain. "What if the person you think you know isn't real? What if everything I've shared with you has been built on deception? Have you lied to me about who you are inside? About your appreciation for simple solutions and terrible coffee? About the way you watch the stars like you're homesick for somewhere you can't return to? No. Those things are real. Then maybe the rest doesn't matter as much as you think it does." Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas's proximity alarms. 3 ships had dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, not Imperial Navy vessels, but something else entirely. The configuration and approach patterns triggered recognition protocols Thomas had hoped never to see activated. "We have a problem," he announced, studying the sensor readings. "Those aren't Imperial forces. They're flying in standard rebel fleet formation." Zara's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of confusion or fear, she displayed the kind of tactical awareness that came from extensive military experience. "How long until they reach us?" 20 minutes, maybe 30 if they're being cautious about the debris field." "Thomas, I need you to hide my ship." Completely. Can you do that? Maybe. Your ship is small enough to fit in the deep storage bay, and I can mask its energy signature, but... do it. Now. The urgency in her voice cut through any remaining questions Thomas might have had. Together, they maneuvered her vessel into the station's most secure storage area, where Thomas activated every stealth and masking system he'd ever installed. This will hide it from casual scans, he said, but if they do a thorough search, they won't have time for thorough. Rebel forces don't waste time on frontier repair stations unless they have specific intelligence. And do they have specific intelligence? Zara's expression was grim. That remains to be seen. As the approaching ships resolved on his screens, Thomas found himself wondering exactly what kind of minor noble inspired Imperial Navy searches and Rebel fleet attention. Whatever Zara's real story was, he was beginning to suspect that minor was not an accurate description. Zara, he said as they waited for the approaching vessels to establish contact, when this is over, I'm going to want some real answers. If we survive this, she replied quietly, I promise you'll have them. The way she said it made Thomas suspect that the answers would be more complicated than he was prepared for. The rebel boarding party arrived with the professional efficiency of people accustomed to hostile inspections. Their leader, a scarred woman with the bearing of someone who'd earned her authority through combat rather than politics, introduced herself as Captain Thorne of the Free Systems Alliance. Mr. Riley, she said, her tone suggesting this was a formality rather than a request, we're conducting searches for Imperial fugitives. I trust you'll cooperate fully. Of course, Captain. Though I should mention that my facility is pretty straightforward, repair bays, living quarters, storage areas. Not much room for fugitives to hide. Thomas was acutely aware of Zara standing just outside the docking bay, concealed behind a stack of salvaged hull plating. Her concealment was temporary at best, and her tension was palpable even from a distance. We're looking for someone specific, Captain Thorne continued, consulting a data pad. Female, traveling alone, vessel matching these specifications. She showed him an image that was unmistakably Zara's ship. Haven't seen anything like that, Thomas lied with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned that frontier survival sometimes required flexible relationships with the truth. Most of my customers fly cargo haulers and mining rigs. Mind if we look around anyway? Not at all. Though I should warn you that some areas of the station are depressurized for maintenance. Captain Thorne's search was thorough but routine, the kind of inspection that followed standard protocols rather than specific intelligence. Thomas began to hope they might actually pull off the deception when one of the rebels called out from the communications array. Captain, we're picking up residual energy signatures consistent with the target vessel. Recent docking, within the last few days. Thomas felt his stomach drop as Captain Thorne's expression shifted from routine suspicion to focused interest. Mr. Riley, it appears you may have had contact with our person of interest after all. Like I said, I get a lot of traffic. Energy signatures could be from any number of vessels. These signatures are quite specific. Military-grade quantum processors, consciousness interface navigation systems, hull materials incorporating rare elements. Captain Thorne studied Thomas carefully. Not the kind of technology typically found on cargo haulers. From behind the hull plating, Thomas heard the soft sound of movement. Zara was repositioning herself, and he realized with growing dread that she was preparing for combat rather than continued concealment. Captain, he said, hoping to draw attention away from Zara's location, even if someone matching your description was here, they're obviously gone now. Your sensors would have detected an active vessel. Unless, Captain Thorne said with growing certainty, that vessel was being deliberately concealed by someone with detailed knowledge of stealth technologies. The situation deteriorated rapidly from there. One of the rebels discovered the entrance to the deep storage bay where Zara's ship was hidden, while another found traces of the rare metals she'd used to pay Thomas, evidence that was difficult to explain away as coincidental. Mr. Riley, Captain Thorne said with the tone of someone whose patience was exhausted, I think it's time you told us the truth about your recent visitors. That was when Zara stepped out from concealment, moving with fluid grace that immediately marked her as far more dangerous than her robes and veil suggested. "Captain Thorne," she said calmly, "I believe you're looking for me." The rebels' reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of treating her as a simple fugitive, they responded as if confronting someone of significant importance. Weapons were drawn, but with the cautious respect reserved for extremely dangerous opponents. "Your Majesty," Captain Thorne said, her voice carrying a mixture of surprise and something that might have been reverence. "We had hoped the reports of your survival were true." Thomas felt the universe shift around him as implications he'd been avoiding crashed into unavoidable reality. "Majesty. Not noble, not even high-ranking official, but royalty of some kind." "I take it," Zara said, her entire bearing having subtly changed to project authority Thomas had never seen her display, "that you are not here to arrest me. We're here to bring you home. The loyalist forces are in disarray without proper leadership. The coup has failed, but consolidation of power requires." "Requires what, Captain?" "That I return to a court filled with people who tried to have me assassinated." Thomas's mental picture of the situation shifted again as more pieces clicked into place. Not just royalty. Someone important enough that her absence affected military campaigns and political stability. "Your Imperial Majesty," Captain Thorne continued, confirming Thomas's worst suspicions about exactly how important his houseguest actually was, "the Empire needs its rightful ruler." "Imperial Majesty." Thomas sat down heavily on a nearby crate, trying to process the fact that he'd been sharing meals and engineering discussions with someone who apparently ruled a significant portion of the galaxy. "Zara," he said quietly, "please tell me you're not actually the Empress of the Andromedan Empire." The silence that followed was answer enough. "Thomas," she said, and her voice carried the same warmth it had during their conversations over terrible coffee, "I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain how the most powerful person in known space ended up eating synthesized protein in my workshop and asking about quantum manifold repairs? The same way anyone else would. My ship was damaged and I needed somewhere safe to make repairs. But you're not anyone else, are you? You're Empress Zara Andromeda III, ruler of 67 star systems and approximately 40 billion people." 43 billion, actually, she said quietly. "And yes." Captain Thorne watched this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing history being made in real time. "Your Imperial Majesty, we have transport standing by. We can return you to the capital immediately. And if I choose not to return? Then the civil war continues, the rebels consolidate their power, and millions more die in the fighting." Thomas looked at Zara, Empress Zara, and saw the weight of impossible decisions settling on her shoulders like a visible burden. "How long?" he asked. "How long what? How long have you been running from this? From being who you are?" 6 months. Since the night they tried to kill me in my sleep and I realized that half my court had been bought by revolutionary factions. And you've been alone all this time? Until I met a frontier engineer who treated me like a person instead of a political symbol. Thomas stood, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. "Zara, I need to ask you something important. The woman I've been talking to for the past few days, the one who appreciates simple solutions and gets homesick watching the stars, is she real, or is she just a role you were playing?" Zara removed her veil entirely, revealing the intricate facial markings that Thomas now realized were imperial ceremonial tattoos. "She's the most real I've been in years," she said. "Thomas, being here, talking with you, working on problems that have actual solutions, it's the first time I've remembered who I am underneath all the ceremony and responsibility. And now? Now I have to decide whether the galaxy is more important than my own happiness." Captain Thorne cleared her throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, the transport is ready when you are." Thomas looked at the woman who had been his mysterious passenger and was apparently one of the most powerful people in known space, and made a decision that surprised even him. What if there was a third option? Both Empress Zara and Captain Thorne stared at Thomas as if he'd just suggested they solve their problems by asking the rebels nicely to stop being difficult. A third option? Captain Thorne asked. You said the coup failed, but consolidation requires the Empress's return. What if she returns, but not alone? What if she brings something the opposition doesn't expect? Thomas, Zara said carefully, what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe the most powerful person in the galaxy could use an engineer who approaches problems without preconceptions about what should or shouldn't be possible. Captain Thorne looked between them with growing understanding. You're proposing to accompany Her Imperial Majesty back to the capital. I'm proposing that we solve this problem the way we've been solving engineering problems, by combining different approaches and building something new. Zara studied Thomas with an expression that mixed hope with concern. Thomas, you have no idea what you're suggesting. The Imperial Court is not a repair station. The people there play games where the stakes are measured in star systems and the penalties for losing tend to be fatal. Then maybe they need someone who doesn't know how to play those games. The court would eat you alive. Maybe. Or maybe they'd find out that frontier engineers are surprisingly hard to digest. Over the next several hours, as they prepared for departure, Thomas began to understand exactly what he'd volunteered for. Captain Thorne briefed them on the political situation, revolutionary cells still active in 12 systems, loyalist forces fragmented and demoralized, and an imperial capital where trust was a luxury no one could afford. The rebels control the primary shipyards and 3 major fleet bases, she explained as they reviewed tactical displays. They're expecting a conventional military response. Imperial forces attempting to retake strategic locations through direct assault. What if we don't give them conventional? Thomas suggested. What if we approach this like a repair job? Meaning we don't try to replace the broken parts, we make them work with what we have. Empress Zara, who had been quietly studying the intelligence reports, looked up with sudden interest. Explain. The rebels have military assets, but they don't have legitimacy. The loyalists have legitimacy but reduced military capacity. Instead of fighting each other until one side wins, what if we found a way to make both sides realize they need each other? That's actually not impossible, Captain Thorne said slowly. The rebel leadership isn't monolithic. Several factions joined the revolution because they felt excluded from imperial governance, not because they want to destroy the empire. So we don't fight them, Zara said, understanding dawning in her voice. We incorporate them. The return journey to the imperial capital took 5 days, during which Thomas received an intensive education in galactic politics while helping Zara plan what would either be the most successful diplomatic revolution in history or the most spectacular political suicide ever attempted. Thomas, she said on the final night before they reached the capital, I need you to understand something. Once we arrive, I won't be Zara anymore. I'll be Empress Zara Andromeda III, and the demands of that role. We'll change everything between us. We'll make everything more complicated. Zara, I've spent my career making complicated things work. I think I can handle complicated. Even when complicated includes death threats, political intrigue, and formal court ceremonies that last for hours. Especially then. Someone needs to be around to point out when the Emperor's new clothes need alterations. She laughed, and the sound was exactly the same as it had been in his workshop, sharing terrible coffee and discussing quantum manifolds. The imperial capital was a study in elegant intimidation, crystal spires that caught starlight and threw it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly, defensive platforms that could level continents, and a palace complex that looked like someone had decided to build a small moon and then decorated it with precious metals. Thomas's first imperial court session was an education in controlled chaos. Hundreds of nobles, military officers, and government officials arranged in precise hierarchies that conveyed information about status, allegiance, and personal ambition. At the center of it all, Empress Zara presided with the kind of natural authority that made it seem inevitable that she would rule billions of people. But when she announced her intention to negotiate with rebel leadership rather than simply crushing them militarily, the court's reaction was immediate and hostile. "Your Imperial Majesty," Duke Altair pronounced with barely concealed disdain, "surely you cannot be serious about treating with traitors and rebels." "I am serious about ending a civil war that serves no one's interests except those who profit from chaos," Zara replied coolly. "And what does your advisor recommend?" The way Duke Altair said advisor made it clear he had other words in mind. Thomas stood, acutely aware that every eye in the hall was fixed on him with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. "Your Grace," he said, "I recommend we stop thinking about this as a problem to be solved through force and start thinking about it as a system that needs to be redesigned." "You would redesign the Empire?" "I would repair it. The way you repair anything complex that stopped working properly. By understanding what each component needs and finding ways to make them work together instead of fighting each other." What followed was the most unconventional diplomatic negotiation in imperial history. Thomas applied engineering principles to political problems, Zara used her authority to create space for previously impossible conversations, and slowly, carefully, they began building bridges between factions that had been trying to destroy each other for months. The breakthrough came when Thomas suggested treating the rebel demands not as ultimatums to be rejected, but as design specifications for an improved imperial system. "They want representation in government," he said during a late-night planning session. "Give them representation. They want economic reforms. Implement the ones that actually make sense. They want accountability from imperial officials. Create accountability systems." "Thomas," Zara said with something that might have been amusement, "you're describing the most comprehensive governmental reform in imperial history." "I'm describing maintenance. When a system breaks down, you don't replace it entirely, you upgrade the parts that aren't working and improve the connections between components." The final negotiation session took place in the same crystal hall where Thomas had first witnessed the full power of imperial ceremony. Representatives from every major rebel faction sat across from imperial officials, with Empress Zara presiding and Thomas serving as an unlikely mediator between worldviews that had seemed incompatible. "The question," Thomas said, addressing the assembled representatives, "is whether we're here to determine who wins, or whether we're here to build something that works for everyone." General Hawk, leader of the largest rebel faction, studied Thomas with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to identifying threats and opportunities. "And you believe such a thing is possible?" "I believe that most conflicts come from people wanting the same things but disagreeing about how to achieve them. Everyone here wants stability, prosperity, and security. The question is whether we can design a system that provides those things more effectively than what we have now." The negotiations took 3 days. Thomas found himself translating between political languages, helping career diplomats understand engineering concepts, and explaining to military leaders why sustainable solutions were more valuable than decisive victories. When the final agreements were signed, the Andromedan Empire had been transformed into something unprecedented. A constitutional monarchy with representation from former rebel systems, economic reforms that addressed the grievances that had fueled the revolution, and governmental accountability systems that would prevent future coups. "Thomas," Empress Zara said as they stood on the palace balcony, watching the celebration in the streets below, "do you realize what we've accomplished? We've made something work that everyone said was impossible to fix. We've created a new model for how interstellar civilizations can govern themselves. We've proven that reform is possible without revolution, that different factions can work together if they're given the right framework." Thomas looked out at the celebration, then at the woman beside him who had somehow remained both an empress and the person who appreciated simple solutions to complex problems. "Zara, what happens now? Now we do the hard work of making these new systems actually function. Now we prove that our agreements can survive contact with reality. And us? What happens to us?" She turned to face him fully, and in her expression he saw both the imperial authority that commanded star systems and the vulnerable woman who had shared terrible coffee in his workshop. "That depends. Are you interested in a permanent position as chief imperial engineer?" The job involves maintaining complex systems, solving problems that everyone else says are impossible, and working with someone who has a tendency to make things more complicated than they need to be. What are the benefits? Excellent health care, access to the finest resources in the galaxy, and the opportunity to help govern 43 billion people. And the downsides? Formal court ceremonies, political intrigue, and the constant risk that your engineering solutions might accidentally reshape galactic civilization. Thomas considered this, watching the fireworks that were lighting up the capital's crystal spires in patterns that would have been impossible on any other world. Will there be terrible coffee? I think that can be arranged. And simple solutions to complex problems? Thomas, we've just negotiated the peaceful resolution of a civil war by treating political reform like a maintenance project. I think simple solutions to complex problems are guaranteed. He took her hand, the same gesture that had started everything in her damaged ship in his repair dock, but now it felt like the foundation for something much larger. Your Imperial Majesty, he said with mock formality, I accept the position. Excellent. Your first assignment is to help me design new governmental systems that can adapt and improve over time instead of breaking down when stressed. And your second assignment, she added, her voice dropping to something more personal, is to help me figure out how to be both an empress and a woman who fell in love with a frontier engineer. Thomas looked at Zara, empress, ruler, partner, and realized that the most complex problems often had the most elegant solutions. Well, he said, I've always been good at making complicated things work. A year later, Thomas stood in his new workshop, a facility that combined the best imperial technology with the creative chaos of his frontier repair station. He was modifying a diplomatic transport when Zara found him, still wearing her ceremonial robes from the morning session with the Galactic Council. How did the vote go? He asked. The constitutional monarchy model is being adopted by 6 other systems. Apparently, the idea of governmental systems that can be maintained and upgraded rather than overthrown and replaced is catching on. Who would have thought that treating politics like engineering would be popular? The woman who trusted a frontier engineer to help her fix an empire, Zara said, settling beside him to watch his work. Thomas, do you ever regret it? Giving up the simple life for all this complexity? Thomas looked around his workshop, then out the window at the crystal spires of the capital, then at the woman who ruled more space than most people could imagine but still made time to appreciate elegant solutions to impossible problems. Zara, I spent years fixing broken ships for people passing through. Now I get to fix broken systems for entire civilizations, with the help of the most extraordinary partner in the galaxy. He took her hand, still amazed by the simple miracle of her trust. Simple was good, but this is better. Even when it involves formal court ceremonies. Especially then. Someone needs to be there to suggest that maybe the Emperor's new clothes could use some practical modifications. And in the workshop of the chief imperial engineer, surrounded by the tools and techniques that had reshaped an empire, they continued the work of building something that had never existed before, a love story that spanned star systems and a partnership that proved the most complex problems could be solved with the simplest principles, genuine respect, creative thinking, and the courage to see past what someone appears to be to discover who they really are.